My name is Galen McCluskey, and I'm Tamarac's Director of Community Innovation, and I'll be our moderator for today. So I'm very, very excited to hear from Heather and Russ today about the 4 agendas for multi-stakeholder collaborations. And for those of you who don't know, Co-Creative is a group that helps people who don't know each other and often don't even like each other change systems together. They work across a range of issues and sectors to develop powerful solutions to complex societal challenges using creative, design-driven engagements. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Heather and Russ, who will share their thoughts and perspectives, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers at the end. So if you have questions throughout, make sure you're capturing them and sending them over. We'll have some chance to dive into them after the presentation by Heather and Russ. So welcome, Heather and Russ. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Galen. Hi, everyone. This is Heather Equinas, and I'm excited to be on the call today with you all. So we have about 25 minutes or so worth of content that we just wanted to share about the 4 agendas, which we think of as sort of a relatively simple framework for leading collaboration, leading multi-stakeholder change initiatives. And so we wanted to give you a little bit of a preview of that. As Galen said, we work with a lot of different stakeholders. Sometimes they don't know each other and sometimes they don't like each other, but ultimately they are interested in sort of solving complex issues together. And so we've been pulling from across a number of fields and domains to put together a process model, approaches, and using various tools and techniques to support people to do that sort of good collaborative work together. And we do it across a lot of different industries. We do it also within place-based communities. So we have experience, working sort of state level initiatives, community, city level initiatives, but then also across industries, working more at a national and international scale as well. And we primarily do that through supporting and designing collaborative innovation networks, which we'll get into in terms of what that means in just a bit. And we also do it through training that we offer and developing support systems for leaders who are leading this kind of multi-stakeholder, multi-sectoral change.
A little bit about what we want to cover today. We want to introduce CALM, which is this 4 agendas framework that has emerged from our work. It's a very simple framework for thinking about key elements that need to be present or addressed or attended to as we support people coming together across various boundaries, whether those boundaries are cultural, political, sectoral, organizational, doesn't really matter. We'll preview those 4 agendas, talk a little bit about each one, and then Heather will share some examples. So we're going to use a particular story about a network that we've helped launch in Hawaii and use that to give some color to each of the agendas, kind of what it looks like in practice. And then we'll end with us sharing some tools that support each agenda. So kind of a classification of tools that get at the intent behind each agenda and help address that need that people have as part of collaboration. So what is collaborative innovation? It's a term that we've kind of adopted, and one of the reasons we adopted this term is because often when people think about innovation, like community innovation, it's less the case now, but there was a time when we started this work that innovation was associated with individuals. So some genius, brilliant person who came up with some great idea, like a social entrepreneur, and that was the breakthrough that was going to change everything. And collaboration was seen as this kind of messy, sloppy, lowest common denominator way of approaching problems. And we believe that the best innovation and the most sustainable and deep innovation comes from really effective collaboration that draws on the diversity of any community. So there's a little bit of a paradox in there, but we're hoping it's not a paradox, that collaboration and innovation actually feed each other and support each other's success. So when we talk about collaborative innovation, it's an approach. So Heather mentioned a a process model, which we're happy to share if we have time, but it's also on our website. It's a set of tools and methods that have been kind of ordered in a certain way to address needs that emerge in a group as they start to do work together, and then as they deepen their shared learning and expand their strategy together. It's a set of patterns, which we won't cover today, but we'll cover in our course at the end of the month in Toronto with Tamarack Institute, and where we also have on our website. One thing about our website is you'll find that we give everything away that we make or that we have. And so even if you're interested in just getting a training manual or anything else that we've created, we're happy to share those. And the patterns that we use and leverage in our work are part of those materials. And then also it's for us a fundamental belief that if people are well supported with a good process and a set of tools and methods that really work, that they can and will actually fall in love with solving big problems together, even if they didn't like each other at the outset, that the process itself produces this kind of evolution in our ways of relating to one another and working together. So just to introduce the 4 agendas here, I want to preface this with we didn't kind of make these up, and they also didn't come from theory. They emerged from our practice because we were realizing that if we neglected certain things in the work, groups didn't work together as effectively. And so we started to identify what are those core elements, those core agendas that we need to attend to help whole people show up in the work. And part of our philosophy is if we're going to change complex whole systems, we need to engage whole human beings. So part of that engagement is through connecting. So building connections, connecting people together and trusting relationships that span the boundaries that often separate us in our work together. Second agenda is about aligning. And so this is what we typically say is aligning a shared intent, so that we ensure that we're in the room for the same reason, that we actually, even if we have differences about how to get to where we want to go, we're generally aligned on what we want to achieve together. And this intent is about more than just setting goals. We'll allude to some of that. And you'll probably see more in our materials about the aligning agenda. The learning agenda kind of seems obvious. If we're going to do anything together, we need to learn together. But often what we've seen in collaborations is that some folks are learning a lot about the system that they're working to change, and other people are kind of in the dark, lacking some pieces of information or insight or analysis. So really this learning agenda is a shared learning agenda. It's what we all need to know together to understand what's happening in the system that we're working in, whether that's the education system or the system that relates to health equity in a community or whatever it is. And so shared learning about what's happening in the system, how we're impacting the way that system is working, where the intervention points might be, et cetera, are all part of this agenda. And then making, which is often, we think, kind of the neglected agenda. So we see groups coming together and connecting, aligning around a shared intent, maybe learning together, but then kind of getting a little bit stuck and falling short of actually making real solutions and interventions that are concrete and grounded and tangible. So we get into learning from design thinking, from agile, other methods that help groups actually come together and build and test and iterate on tangible solutions. So the whole person aspect of the 4 agendas is that each of these relates to a part of being a human being. So if I'm truly connected to other people in the work, that is an experience that I have in my heart. I feel that connection in my heart. And if you don't feel that connection in your heart, there may be something missing in terms of the connecting agenda. Can I really trust these people? Do I actually, at some level, love the people that I'm working with, even if I vehemently disagree with some of their analysis or perspectives? The aligning agenda we equate with the spirit, because what we've observed in the work across many different collaborations that we've supported is when people are truly aligned around a greater purpose that's meaningful, that's powerful and compelling, it's a spiritual experience. People feel that kind of transcendent spiritual experience in the work. The learning agenda we equate with the head. That probably makes sense. We think this agenda, working kind of from the head and working from a sense of understanding what's going on, may be actually the most overused agenda, at least to the neglect of some of these others. We think that if we just all kind of rationally understand what's happening, that we're magically going to organize ourselves and change the way the system is working. But it's an important agenda. It's one that we want to also put in the context of the other three agendas. And then, as I mentioned, the making agenda, which we equate with the hands. So this goes to metaphors like rolling up our sleeves, getting our hands dirty, digging into it with our hands. But this very physical kind of act of actually creating things together is also a very compelling and powerful part of the human experience. So you'll notice that a bit of tricky animation there. Even though we use the acronym CALM, we tend to think of these things in this order. So we prefer to start with the aligning work when we're initiating a collaboration, and then go into what we call connecting the change system, the connecting agenda, and then learning, and then making. And we're happy to share more about our thinking about the ordering of these later in the webinar.
Great, so I'm going to walk through an example of how these four agendas have been leveraged in a particular network that we support called Nakama a Haloa. Next slide. Thank you. So Nakama is a network that we support in Hawaii, and it translates to the children of Haloa. And Haloa is sort of the first Native Hawaiian ancestor and came from the taro plant, which is what you see on the screen there. So Nakama Haloa is a network, a multi-stakeholder collaboration that has a shared goal around Native Hawaiian youth that are affected by the foster care system. Their goal is to ensure that every Native Hawaiian youth that is affected by the foster care system has a lasting network of relationships that they can sustain and that can sustain them. So it's really about relational permanency for Native Hawaiian young people that are in the foster care system. So I'm going to walk through what an initial launch meeting of that network looked like and how the different agendas showed up in that meeting. So in terms of the connecting agenda, first, we really think about how we can intentionally set the space to really build good connection and collaboration. And so the space that we used for that particular launch meeting is, hopefully if you're viewing, you can see that it's this beautiful round space. It's pretty unusual in terms of the atmosphere. It's also owned by a Native Hawaiian collective, and there's various cultural events that occur there regularly. It's also used by day as a co-working space. It's somewhat interesting in that there's no shoes allowed in the space, so everyone has to kick off their shoes or flip-flops before they enter the room. So there's sort of like this ceremonial sense of just being in that space. It's relatively relaxed, even by Hawaii standards. So we think a lot about what kind of space people are going to be walking into that's going to create a sense of connection and support folks to build relationships. And so this space really fit the bill. Next up, we think about the people. So this is a picture of the design team that supports the Nakama Haloa work. So in our networks, we have backbone organizations. Some of the folks that you see in this picture are from that backbone organization. In this case, it's an NGO that sort of sits at the space between child welfare services and families and resource caregivers. So they're sort of like in the gap and acutely feel the pain that comes when young people do not have relational permanency in their lives, and when they're part of the foster care system. Also part of this design team are staff members from Child Welfare Services, Department of Health and Human Services, and also several staff members from different Native Hawaiian serving organizations. And so this design team is this wonderful compilation of different parts of the system that we know need to be knitted together in order to create the kind of change we're looking for Native Hawaiian youth. And so this design team, I'll go into it deeper in the slide deck, but they've been doing about 4 months of work together before they've come to this space, invited additional network members to be part of this particular collaboration. In terms of connecting the participants that came to this convening, there were about 30 folks, and one of the questions that we had for people in the morning was to please share your highest hopes for our work together. And so this is a way we intentionally designed sort of questions to support people to get to core values that they have or aspirations that they have for our work together, to again connect us at that heart level. So the next agenda that we wanted to talk through was aligning around shared intent. And so I wanted to give a few examples of how that showed up in this particular convening. So at the start of the session, we work hard to make sure that we're all aligned around the purpose of why it is that we're, what we're going to be doing together over the next, in this case, day and a half. And so you can see here, we sort of validated that this is the purpose of our work together, which was to connect around our shared values, shared intent for this work, and also a set of priority initiatives that we would be designing together to really advance that relational permanency that we wanted to see for Native Hawaiian youth in the foster care system. We also aligned around very specific session outcomes that correspond to the 4 agendas. So we make explicit that we do have desired outcomes related to each of those agendas: the connecting agenda, aligning, learning, and making. And so these are the things that we're testing with folks and asking, are you willing to work together and with us to achieve these specific outcomes? So another part of our aligning agenda is aligning around a working goal. So before we've even gotten in the room together, the design team has gone out and done, in this case, it was about 40 interviews with different system leaders, content experts, but also context experts, people with lived experience that are part of the foster care system, and tested a draft working goal with these folks before we got in the room. Made many modifications to the working goal, or some, and tested a version 1 of a working goal, and got feedback on that, did a second iteration, and so what you see on the screen is the working goal version 2, which we then tested again during the session, and you can see the additions that were made to it. So this is where we really want to spend time to make sure that as a network, we are aligned on what we call a massed goal, a meaningful, audacious, specific, and time-bound goal that's really going to hold us together even when work might get challenging. We also think about aligning around scope. And so for scope, we use a particular tool that we call focus and frame. And so this is really about articulating what's the focus or in scope of our work together. And so you can see here, it was really clear that we were focused on Native Hawaiian children and youth in the foster care system, and around relational permanency. And there are additional things that are still in frame as we pursue this particular focus. And ideally, whatever solutions we're creating to support the folks that are in focus to us are ideally benefiting folks that are in frame. But at least we're making sure that there's not going to be some inadvertent sort of negative implications or consequences for what sort of like all Native Hawaiian children or all children and youth in the foster care system by the solutions that we're designing for what's in focus for us. So in terms of learning about the system, just a few slides here on the way in which we sort of unpack what we've learned about the sort of landscape. So next slide, please. So before, as I mentioned, this network was even convened, that design team went out and did all of those interviews with system leaders and context experts as well, and themed those insights from those interviews and brought them into the room together. So we could sort of walk through it and unpack it together. And so what you see on the poster on the screen are a number of insights. Some of it's color-coded in terms of we've identified various challenges that are part of that system, as well as what's working, as well as opportunities. And then also interspersed in those insights are direct quotes that largely came from young people or bio parents that have had their children removed, or resource caregivers, foster care families, and their direct experiences that relate to these themes that have emerged through system leader conversations as well. And so we spend time as a network walking through, I think in this network convening, there were probably, I think, 5 mural-sized papers like that of insights. And next slide, we also add to them. So the point here is that, you know, it's often the case that when folks arrive to a network, they're holders of some of the knowledge, but not all of the knowledge. And so this is a moment where we get to sort of unpack and make sense of the system together and contribute additional, what you see on the post-it notes, are additional insights that emerged from the network members themselves. So we build out a more complete holistic picture of what's happening in the dynamics in any given system. So in terms of the, going back to aligning on shared intent, once we have this sort of shared understanding of the landscape, with the Nakama folks, we asked folks to begin to align around specific critical shifts that they believe would be necessary in the system in order for us to achieve that working goal that we had shared earlier. And so when we think about critical shifts, it's really a pretty simple 2-part statement. The first part is about what's the way things are working now in some particular part of the system, and what that piece of the system would look like in our desired future state. So we have a process by which we support people to generate, sort of diverge in their thinking about developing critical shifts, and then also start to converge in their thinking about critical shifts. And so the next slide has the first pass at the critical shifts that the Nakama Ahaloa network aligned around. Side note, that their work has continued. This was probably a year and a half ago now. And so they've narrowed further and they're really focused on 4 specific critical shifts in order to achieve their goal at this point in time. So the next agenda we wanted to just share a few examples of from this particular convening is around the making agenda. So making specific solutions. So once members of this network aligned on those top critical shifts, next slide, we walk through a process of generating many different ideas for solutions. So again, I know we're not going deep into the patterns, but we consistently use this divergence and convergence pattern where we really support people to diverge in their thinking, generate many different possible solutions, and then start to prioritize and converge into a set of top ideas, which we then support folks to develop further out into concepts. And so we have various tools, as Russ mentioned. One of them is a concept worksheet, and that's what you see folks here starting to complete. And so it's really asking folks like, how does this idea work? Who might be necessary partners? What kind of resources are necessary? What are the biggest challenges? How might we overcome them? So starting to get more concrete with specific solutions. And then from there, next slide, we support there's a feedback, people get feedback on their concepts, right? So the most promising after that sort of vetting process, move into a state of prototyping. And so here's just a few examples of what some of the prototypes look like that emerged from the Nakama network. So you can see here, some of it was around training, some of it was around staffing, and some of it was around system redesign.
So I want to note there was a question from Heather about the process we use to identify critical shifts. And there are a few different processes, but one of our favorites is, I might call it 2x4x8. So we have people individually prioritize 2 shifts that they think are the most critical to address. And then they pair up, and in pairs, they agree on their top 2 shifts. And then they get in groups of 4 together. So 2 pairs form a group of 4. And then eventually we end up with groups of 8. And those groups of 8 have to prioritize 2 most critical shifts. So sometimes we use that, sometimes we use just dot voting. And we're not trying to get it exactly right. All the stuff that Heather just mentioned happened in one launch meeting for this network. So it's really kind of a first rough pass. And a lot of what we're doing is to keep everything kind of iterative and working as things as working versions and hypotheses, which helps people stay in this kind of inquiring, learning kind of creative space, and avoids this problem where people feel like, oh, if I don't get my agenda in now, or my favorite idea or whatever, it's never gonna happen. So we're just kind of drafting, first draft of the critical shifts. From there, the first set of ideas. From there, and those ideas can emerge things that can include things that are already happening. So an idea doesn't have to be new. It could be scaling some solution that's already working on one island, but it hasn't been brought to the other islands in this story. You know, the concepts, the prototypes, all of these are just kind of first drafts, and we're kind of sketching them in, and then we want to test them and maybe refine them as we get more learning, or maybe throw them out and pivot to some other idea because we realize that the concept or prototype we've been developing really isn't going to achieve the shift that we wanted to achieve. So just to wrap up the presentation here, we've, and you'll all get the slide deck, we've captured some of the methods that we use to support each of the agendas. So in the aligning agenda, you'll see what Heather referred to as the masked goal. So this is the big audacious kind of, guiding goal that a network will adopt. And as you saw, we iterate on that. We maintain versioning. So it's never, the goal in year 5 of a collaboration can evolve because the appetite of the group or the need of the system has evolved during that time. We have another kind of goal we're experimenting with called epic goals. Sometimes networks adopt 2 kinds of goals. Some are more kind of rational and measurable, and others are more poetic and kind of culturally meaningful. And then we have these other elements related to aligning, which we're happy to share. Connecting, you'll notice things that look familiar on here, introductions, check-ins. In Hawaii, they call it talk story, but sharing stories. For example, a really beautiful one to connect people is share a story about a time you took a risk based on your values, which gets people into the mindset for the kind of risk-taking and courage that's going to be required to take on the work that they're setting out to do. We'll often have people introduce themselves and share a core value that drives their work. Things like that. Anything that helps people understand one another better as human beings and deepen the trust. Whoops. Now we have learning. So these are some things that you would probably notice, but we have kinds of two types of stakeholder interviews that we do. We have more like a system leader interview. So somebody who's a leader in an organization that's providing services, for example. And then an empathy interview, which we would typically do with someone who's a context expert, who's experiencing some kind of dysfunction in the system because it's failing, the system is failing them in terms of support or in terms of the kind of resources that they need. And then the making agenda, we have various methods for that. We've talked about the concepts. We actually have a worksheet which we'll print out as a poster, as you saw in one of the photos, for folks to develop out an idea. So an idea is just an idea. It's pretty simple, it's pretty undefined, but we ask people to really quickly transition from an idea to a concept that says who, what, when, where, why would this idea be effective. And then we start building prototypes, so really concrete representations of what that concept would look like if we actually developed it. So that's it for our presentation. I see there's a few more questions. I think we'll turn it over to Galen, but now you'll note on the screen here we have resources available, as I mentioned. And if there's anything that we mentioned on the website or anything you think we might have that's not on the website, please let us know if you're unable to find it. Some of the materials that we give away, we just don't post on the website because things like training manuals change often. So we just like to keep the current version up to date.
Thanks, Russ, and thanks, Heather. Really, really exciting to kind of have an overview of those 4 agendas. And as you mentioned, this is a fantastic time for people to share their questions and pass them along. So I see a few ones coming through already that we can just start in with. So one question that I see from Margaret actually is about evaluating the effectiveness of the network itself. So do you have any thoughts you can share on how you evaluate the effectiveness of the network collaboration? So not the issue, but specifically the network and how it's working together.
Yeah, well, there's a couple different things to evaluate, right? Is our system change strategy effective? Is it at the right scale, et cetera? In terms of the effectiveness of the work together, we've actually drafted and we've done some beta testing on a self-evaluation that networks can use. Not network leaders, but we actually encourage all the members of a network or a collaborative to both respond to the assessment and to make sense of the results together. And it's essentially based on the 4 agendas. So how well are we doing in terms of connecting the change system together? What is the the level of trust and openness and courage and safety in the group? Do we have the right people to do the work that we've set out to do? Because part of connecting an effective change system is making sure that we've got the right people in the room to do the work. Are we, in the aligning agenda, are we truly aligned around this goal, or is there more work to be done? And one of the things you noticed in Heather's presentation of the Nakama Aloha story is the agendas kind of come online, but then they keep coming back. You know, the aligning agenda is always in play. We may refine our scope at some point. We may modify our goal in some way. We're always learning, continuously learning as we proceed in the work. We have networks that have, one network started in 2002, and every network meeting, they're still sharing new learning. And that's obviously a network that's now kind of self-organizing, and they're doing much different work than they were when they started, what was that, 17, 18 years ago. But
I would
yeah.
I would also offer up that there's one network that we support in the Portland, Oregon, Tri-County region called Already, and they've done some really interesting work on evaluating the effectiveness of their network, and they've been doing surveying. They did an initial evaluation after the first launch meeting, and the last two network meetings as well. And so they've been using a particular tool that they've designed that's pretty robust as well. So if you're interested in that tool, we'd be happy to get you connected with Already. I'm sure they'd be happy to share that particular tool.
And one of our ground rules for evaluation is no third-party evaluation, meaning we don't have people come into networks and evaluate the network and then give a report to someone else. Any evaluation that's done, the participants in the network should be a part of, because ultimately they are the change system that we're working to foster and develop and support. And if they're not learning about what seems to be working or not working in their work, then the learning really has no relevance or power or meaning.
Yeah, that's a really important point. So thanks for those tools that you mentioned. I see a number of different comments already popping up saying that people would love to see the tool. And thanks, Heather, already for responding. This is perfect. I love that this is turning into a really organic conversation. So another question that I saw come through was a question around the process for the 4 agendas, whether they can be separated into separate meetings and how much time to kind of give to that. And this maybe is a good opportunity for us to dive deeper a little bit into a conversation about the interdependency between these different agendas. You know, you mentioned that a little bit, and I'd love to know more about how these agendas work together and whether they can be separated in the way that this question is suggesting from Heather. So would love to hear your thoughts, Russ and Heather, on the interdependency of these and whether they can be separated into different meetings or gatherings.
Mm-hmm.
Heather, do you want to respond to the separating point?
Yeah, I would offer up, so one of the benefits that we often have in the network sessions that we get to support and design is that people, they tend to be a full day at least, and they're often a day and a half. And so we have really the gift of being able to integrate all of these agendas in that length of a session. I also recognize doing a number of place-based projects that sometimes people aren't willing to give up a whole day when that meeting is happening in their own community. You know, like sometimes we're working with an hour or 2 hours. And so in those moments, we have done work where we have much sort of shorter sessions together, and so we do need to prioritize some of those agendas in those sessions. That said, I feel like there's almost always some aligning and connecting that needs to happen in those sessions, even if it's just around validating our shared goal together or validating the shifts that we designed earlier. And then we're going to go deeper in a particular session around learning, for example. We might have a session that's really focused on making, but there's still some level of connecting and aligning that needs to occur before we sort of roll up our sleeves and start prototyping. So I'd say that it's more likely that they're almost always all present, but it's just what's the mix. So sometimes we spend more time making, it's 80% making, and 10 and 10 elsewhere.
Yeah, I think in terms of the interdependency, one thing I want to note is we introduced what you might typically call the steering committee, and there are different terms used by different collective impact initiatives, but we refer to as the design team. And part of the reason we chose that term was because number one, we were trying to get away from the idea that a small group is steering everyone else in terms of the thinking and the strategy and the intent and all that. That really the network should be owning that together. And so the design team and our approach is more of a group of what we came to call catalytic shepherds. So they're catalyzing the work, they're getting more people engaged, they're kind of the kind of core of the energy and momentum, but they're also shepherding the work together. And so we're asking the design team to partly take responsibility for shaping agendas, and that includes deciding, because they're kind of a microcosm of the larger network, they would have a pretty good sense of how we're doing on each of the agendas. So as we're designing the next meeting program, for example, we're working with the design team and we're talking about what do we need to do around connecting? Do we need to do more work around aligning the intent? How are we doing on making and advancing the concrete initiatives? And so the design team is kind of doing that role of kind of shepherding the design of the process based on the 4 agendas, because they're plugged into the network and they're also experiencing what's going on. So it's very much up to what the group needs at that time, given where they are on each of the agendas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for clarifying that and clarifying the role of the design team in kind of helping the collaborative adapt and be responsive to the needs of the group. I think that as well as our conversation around evaluation kind of bridges us really nicely into a question that just came through from Amanda. Looking to learn more about your role in this process. How do you navigate your role as consultants or outsiders in some ways in supporting network development, particularly because you mentioned the importance of the network, learning and growing and forming together. What does your role look like, and how might that change over the course of your work with the network?
Heather?
I was asking who to start. Yeah. So I would say that it certainly evolves. It's usually the case that there's some spark of an idea for a network that emerges from a community or from an industry, and which often translates to some backbone organization that's willing to sort of take on that role of being the glue, and at least the first sort of primary catalyst for the startup of a given network. And that's usually our primary partner that we begin to collaborate with and support them to think through the design and startup of a particular network. Russ just mentioned the design team, which is sort of that microcosm of the larger system that we're working to create change within. And so that group of people is then become sort of our the folks that we offer sort of most consultation and support to as they go out and begin to learn more deeply about the system. And so in many ways, we're sort of supporting the sort of capacity on the ground, and learning alongside of them. And so our role sort of is different in different networks. Some networks want to utilize some support and sort of going out and starting to do some system leader interviews or empathy interviews with context experts. And so we'll sort of walk side by side the design team and backbone team members as they start up and sort of launch a network in that way. And then we also offer process design consultation when it comes to those launch sessions or any of those network meetings. Early on in the life of a network, we're often in a larger facilitation role in some of those sessions. But then even at initial launch meetings, though, design team members have roles, as well as backbone staff have roles in terms of facilitation during those sessions. And so I would say, it's often the case that pretty quickly we're starting to transition our way out of networks, especially the facilitation part of networks. And the staff on the ground are playing a larger and larger role.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would add our entire intent is to build a powerful change system that's going to keep going forward. And so we're, from the beginning, working to kind of decenter ourselves in the work. And we recognize that we're often bringing a difference, sometimes the difference is just that we're not from that community. And so we can hold this space in a somewhat different way than someone from the community, for example. But we eventually want that difference to be integrated into the change system locally, so that someone else can hold this space effectively, to create the safety, to create the creative kind of space that we need.
Yeah. And that bridges nicely into a question from Katie, which is actually looking at the readiness of collaborators in the network. Because your intent is to kind of build this powerful change system that we're, part of that process is people in the system growing and learning together. How do you create a space where at the beginning people can kind of get ready to collaborate? Because I'm guessing that people come into the network or the collaboration with very different places that they're coming from, very different kind of experiences with working in a collaborative way. So I'm curious if there's anything you do around building readiness around collaboration.
Well, the interview process that Heather mentioned is really key to that. So I think the least effective approach is to say, hey, we want to have a meeting about Native Hawaiian youth in the foster system. Let's send out invitations and see who shows up. Because we haven't done any kind of aligning. We haven't done any real connecting. We don't even know why those people are showing up. We could literally have somebody showing up because there's a free lunch, right? I mean, literally a free lunch. And so in the interviews, we're socializing and testing and refining the goal. So the goal that we actually test in interview number 20 is different than the goal that we tested in interview number 3. We're building relationships and trust in those interviews by deeply listening to people, reflecting back what they're sharing, and they're seeing their wisdom later reflected in that system map, the landscape map that Heather showed. We're also learning, of course, a lot, and I think it's really important for people to see that their perspective and their part of the picture was reflected in what emerged later. But then also in the first meeting, we're of course doing all this connecting stuff, like having people share their values, having people tell stories from their lives, maybe having people name and honor an ancestor that they're bringing into the room to help guide their participation in the network. Depending on the cultural context, things like that are really beautiful ways to start connecting people early on. But I think a lot of the work has to happen, not a lot, but a good chunk of the work of connecting and aligning should happen before people get in the room. And that includes who's in the room. So if people are ready to work on the goal that we've been socializing and testing, then we want them in the room. If they are opposed to it, maybe we want them in the room, but later. We think it's really important to be very intentional about designing a change system that's ready to move forward. And the people who are not ready or resistant, we can engage, but it's not really usually effective to engage them right up front.
Gotcha. Thank you. That's really good context on the importance of building those relationships before we get in the room the first time. And I think stands out as something that is a really unique part of your approach, which segues really nicely into the last question we'll have a chance to discuss, which is from Lori. And the question is, what would you consider to be the key innovation of your approach to intersectoral collaboration? And I think for me, what stands out about this is, what makes your approach different or unique in terms of how you work to support collaborative innovation?
To me, it's that it's, so I don't think well, to me, it's a mashup of lots of different approaches that exist in the field already. So, we draw from human-centered design thinking, systems thinking work, lean and agile. Like there's many of these tools, even appreciative inquiry, many of these tools exist already. I feel like it's just the combining of them into this particular approach to collaborations that is what to me is most distinctive.
Yeah, I would say in the experience of it, what people find distinctive is how quickly we build trust and alignment that then creates the conditions for the group to move really quickly together. And alignment, including that we've shared the learning about what we're seeing in this larger system. And a lot of things that we're doing around the 4 agendas are things that create the conditions where power dynamics kind of get addressed. So in a training a couple of years ago, somebody said at day 2 of the training, they said, well, how do decisions get made? And I said, I don't know. And it wasn't that, it was that decisions were clearly made, but they were made by the group as part of the process. And they weren't made in a secret room by the design team or whatever. But the decisions emerged as the work proceeded because of the way the process works. So it's a really interesting dynamic where if you're able to create the right conditions, groups actually work really naturally and effectively together as if it's almost our natural state. And what we typically get in terms of unproductive conflict and stuckness in groups is actually kind of an unnatural state.
Really interesting, fascinating. Thank you. So I wish we had more time for this conversation. I wanted to thank everyone for sending in all your questions. And if there are any follow-up questions, feel free to send them through in an email. And thank you to Russ and Heather, of course, for sharing some of your experiences and for sharing your approach and your thoughts on how to support collaborative innovation today. So thank you both for joining us.
Thanks, Galen, for hosting.
So just wanted to give a few additional housekeeping items to everyone still on the call. Number one, in a few days, you're going to receive a follow-up email with a link to the video recording of today's call. And we also have some learning opportunities that those of you who are on the call today might be curious to know more about. So Russ and Heather mentioned that they're joining us in Toronto on January 29th for a full day to dive more deeply into their approach to leading multi-stakeholder collaboration. So this will build on many of the different topics we touched upon today, but it'll be a great chance to get more hands-on with tools and approaches and work with others who are interested in adopting some of these methods and ways of supporting collaborative innovation. Also coming up on March 4 to 5th, also in Toronto, is a two-day workshop looking at how to facilitate co-design sessions. So helping to prepare you to host and lead creative and collaborative community innovation and engagement sessions. So those are two opportunities that you might find really interesting, and we hope that you will join us for them. So once again, thanks to everyone for coming out. And thanks again to Russ and Heather for sharing their expertise with us today. Take care, everyone.